On the night of June 5, 1944, the skies over southern England were alive with activity. Hundreds of transport planes warmed their engines, lined up in rows on grass and concrete airstrips. Crews moved quickly, checking parachutes, loading equipment, and reviewing last-minute orders. This was the beginning of Operation Neptune, the airborne component of the Allied invasion of France. The destination was Normandy, a region on the northern coast of France occupied by German forces. The mission was simple to explain but difficult to execute. Drop thousands of American paratroopers behind enemy lines to capture bridges, secure roads, and block German reinforcements from reaching the beaches where Allied forces would land at dawn. The American units chosen for this task were the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Between them, more than 13,000 men would jump into France that night. The scale of the operation was unlike anything seen before. The Germans had used paratroopers earlier in the war, most famously during the invasion of Crete, but never on this level. In 1944, no other army had the resources to move so many men by air in one coordinated strike. German officers believed that airborne landings would be small, scattered raids meant to cause confusion. They did not expect an entire airborne army to descend from the sky. The technical planning behind the operation was immense. Nearly 900 C-47 transport aircraft were assembled for the mission, each one carrying about 30 paratroopers fully armed and ready for combat. These planes would take off in tightly timed waves, forming long columns in the night sky as they crossed the English Channel. Pathfinders, small teams of specially trained paratroopers, jumped first to mark the drop zones with lights and radio beacons. Behind them came the main force, jumping into darkness lit only by moonlight and tracer fire. Supplies such as ammunition, radios, and even small artillery pieces were packed into special containers and dropped by parachute alongside the men. Coordinating this many planes and troops required precision. Pilots flew at low altitude, maintaining formation while under threat from German anti-aircraft guns. Navigation depended on dead reckoning and radio signals. Many of the pilots had never flown combat missions at night, and the stress was extreme. The paratroopers, loaded down with rifles, machine guns, grenades, and rations, waited inside the planes in silence, the roar of engines so loud they could barely hear each other. As they neared the French coast, flak burst around them, shaking the aircraft. Green lights signaled the jump, and men hurled themselves into the night. The landings were chaotic. Wind, darkness, and enemy fire scattered the paratroopers across the countryside. Some units landed miles away from their assigned objectives. Men became lost in the hedgerows, small fields divided by thick earth banks and dense brush that made movement slow and confusing. Yet even scattered groups of paratroopers were dangerous. They set up roadblocks, ambushed German patrols, and seized key points wherever they could. One famous action occurred near Bricourt Manor, where a small group of men from Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, disabled a German artillery battery that was shelling the beaches. Their success opened a vital path inland for the seaborne troops. From the German point of view, the situation was overwhelming. Reports came in from across Normandy of enemy troops appearing everywhere at once. Communications broke down as telephone lines were cut and radio signals jammed. German officers struggled to make sense of the scale of the attack. Some believed entire divisions had been dropped, far more than was actually the case. In the dark hours of the early morning, confusion turned to alarm. Reinforcements were ordered forward, only to be ambushed or delayed by roadblocks and blown bridges. At German headquarters, senior officers debated the nature of the attack. Some insisted it was only a diversion, a prelude to a larger landing elsewhere, perhaps at the Pas de Calais. Others argued that this was the real invasion. Adolf Hitler himself refused to release key armored divisions without his personal approval, and he was asleep when the first reports arrived. Hours were lost as officers waited for orders. When the tanks finally moved, they were too late to throw the Allies back into the sea. The American airborne troops fought isolated battles throughout the night and into the next day. Small groups held bridges against repeated counterattacks. Others fought for control of villages that commanded the roads leading to the beaches. Despite being scattered and often outnumbered, they held firm. Their presence forced the Germans to divert units away from the coast, weakening their response to the main invasion force landing on Utah and Omaha beaches. By the time dawn broke on June 6th, the paratroopers had created enough disruption to give the seaborne troops a fighting chance. German officers who survived the first day were left stunned. They had not believed it possible for any army to drop thousands of men by parachute in a single night. The sheer number of planes, the coordination required, and the speed with which the Americans had acted were beyond anything the Germans had prepared for. Many German units fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by the scale of the attack and the constant arrival of new Allied forces. For the first time, they faced an enemy with resources so vast that even a scattered airborne operation could succeed. The success of the airborne landings on D-Day was not without cost. Casualties were high. Many men were killed or captured before they could link up with their units. Planes were shot down, and equipment was lost in flooded fields. Yet the mission achieved its purpose. By dawn, the Americans controlled key routes leading inland from Utah Beach. The bridges were held, and German reinforcements were delayed. This set the stage for the larger battle to come, as the Allied armies pushed deeper into France. The success of the airborne assault on the night of June 5, 1944, depended on a level of planning and technical precision never attempted before. Nearly 900 C-47 transport planes were assembled to carry the paratroopers across the English Channel. Each aircraft was stripped down to hold between 28 and 30 men, all fully armed and carrying everything they needed for combat. In total, the fleet would move more than 13,000 troops in a single night. The sight of so many planes taking off in succession was unlike anything the soldiers or pilots had ever seen. Engines roared as they lifted into the night sky, forming long columns that stretched for miles, each plane flying at a fixed altitude and speed to prevent collisions in the darkness. The organization of the drop was designed to make sure these thousands of men landed on target and in fighting shape. The first to go were the Pathfinders, small teams of highly trained paratroopers who jumped ahead of the main force. Their job was to locate the designated drop zones and mark them with radio beacons and signal lights. These beacons guided the incoming aircraft and gave the pilots a visual reference in the chaos of night flight. Without the Pathfinders, the main body of paratroopers would risk scattering across the countryside, unable to link up and complete their objectives. Coordination extended far beyond the airborne troops themselves. Naval gunfire and bomber units were tasked with softening up enemy positions before the paratroopers landed. Communications between air, sea, and land forces had to be synchronized to the minute. Timing was critical. Too early, and the Germans would be alerted before the main invasion began. Too late, and the beach landings would face heavy resistance without the support of the airborne units inland. The complexity of this plan required detailed rehearsal. In the weeks before D-Day, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions carried out large-scale practice jumps over the English countryside. These rehearsals included everything from the timing of takeoffs to the coordination of signals between planes and ground units. Transporting equipment was another challenge. The paratroopers needed more than rifles and grenades to hold their objectives. Anti-tank guns, radios, mortars, and heavy machine guns were essential for defending bridges and road junctions against German counterattacks. Since these weapons were too heavy for a man to carry during a jump, they were packed into specialized containers and dropped separately by parachute. Each unit had to locate its equipment quickly upon landing, often under fire, and set it up before the enemy arrived. The efficiency of this process was critical to survival. Behind the scenes, logistics officers worked tirelessly to ensure that every detail was ready. Fuel supplies for the aircraft, spare parts for maintenance, parachutes packed and inspected, and thousands of maps printed and distributed to unit commanders all had to be in place. The sheer scale of preparation was staggering. It reflected the industrial power of the United States, which could produce and maintain the vast quantities of material required for an operation of this size. The Germans, by contrast, were operating with dwindling resources. Their paratrooper units, known as Fallschirmjäger, were skilled and experienced but limited in number. German airborne operations earlier in the war had been daring but small in scale, often involving only a few hundred or at most a few thousand men. By 1944, German paratroopers were mostly used as elite infantry rather than for large airborne assaults. They lacked the transport planes, fuel, and supplies needed to conduct major drops. German officers understood the challenges of airborne warfare, which made what they witnessed on the night of June 5 all the more shocking. To see nearly 900 aircraft flying in precise formation, delivering thousands of enemy soldiers deep into their rear areas, was beyond anything they had considered possible. This was not just a tactical move. It was a display of industrial strength and organizational skill. Even the flight paths had to be carefully calculated. The planes crossed the English Channel in waves, timed so that each division would reach its drop zones without interfering with the others. Weather conditions were closely monitored. Pilots were briefed on navigation points and instructed to fly low to avoid radar detection while maintaining strict radio silence to prevent giving away their positions. In an era before modern GPS, this required exceptional skill. Any mistake could scatter entire battalions across the countryside, leaving them vulnerable and ineffective. The American paratroopers themselves underwent rigorous preparation. They trained not only for the physical demands of jumping from a plane with full combat gear but also for the complex missions they would face once on the ground. Exercises simulated bridge seizures, demolition of enemy equipment, and rapid establishment of defensive positions. These rehearsals built confidence and teamwork, essential qualities when small units might find themselves isolated behind enemy lines. From the German perspective, the contrast was stark. Their own airborne forces had been cut back after heavy losses earlier in the war. They had neither the numbers nor the logistical support to mount anything on this scale. German officers were accustomed to fighting an enemy with strength in certain areas, but the sight of such overwhelming air mobility was new. They realized they were facing an opponent with the ability to project power anywhere, in numbers they could not match. For them, the vast fleet of C-47s and the disciplined, well-equipped troops they carried represented not just a tactical threat but a glimpse into the future of warfare. The night sky over Normandy on June 5, 1944, was filled with the steady drone of aircraft engines. Below, German searchlights swept the darkness, cutting through patches of mist and low clouds. As the first waves of American C-47s approached the coast, German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Tracer rounds arced upward, creating a deadly web that shook the planes as they pushed forward. Paratroopers inside the aircraft gripped their gear tightly, waiting for the green light that would signal the jump. Many men had never faced combat before, and now they were about to leap into a battlefield they could not see. As the paratroopers exited the planes, chaos began immediately. Winds pushed men off course. Clouds obscured landmarks, making navigation difficult for pilots. Some planes were forced to take evasive action to avoid enemy fire, further scattering the formations. Entire sticks of paratroopers landed miles from their assigned drop zones. Squads were separated from their platoons, and platoons from their companies. In the darkness, men struggled to cut themselves free of parachutes caught on hedgerows, trees, and flooded fields. Many carried heavy loads of equipment, some weighing close to 100 pounds, making it hard to move quickly once on the ground. For some, the landing was deadly. Several paratroopers drowned in fields deliberately flooded by the Germans to hinder movement. Others were shot before they could even unclip their harnesses. Units that were supposed to arrive as cohesive fighting forces were now broken into scattered groups, each unsure of its location and cut off from higher command. Despite this, training and discipline took over. Small groups of soldiers began to move toward the sound of gunfire, seeking out fellow paratroopers and attacking targets of opportunity as they went. The Normandy countryside added to the confusion. The region was crisscrossed with hedgerows, thick earth embankments topped with dense vegetation that divided the fields into a patchwork maze. Visibility was often limited to just a few feet. Movement was slow and dangerous, with every bend in the path a potential ambush site. In this environment, firefights erupted suddenly and at close range. American paratroopers used their knowledge of small unit tactics to turn these isolated encounters into advantages. Even when outnumbered, they struck quickly and disappeared into the night, sowing confusion among the German defenders. Throughout the early hours of June 6, dozens of these skirmishes flared across the region. In one sector, a group of men from the 101st Airborne seized a vital bridge before the Germans could destroy it, ensuring that reinforcements from the beaches would have a clear route inland. In another, a squad took control of a crossroads that was critical for enemy movement, holding it against repeated counterattacks. Perhaps the most famous action of the night occurred near Brecourt Manor, where Lieutenant Richard Winters and men from Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, assaulted a German artillery position. The guns there were firing directly on Utah Beach, threatening the success of the amphibious landings. Using precise tactics, Winters' small force neutralized the battery and silenced the guns. Their success saved countless lives on the beach and became a textbook example of a well-executed infantry assault. As these actions unfolded, German command posts were thrown into turmoil. Reports poured in from across Normandy, each one painting a different picture of the situation. Some officers reported enemy activity near key towns. Others claimed that entire regiments had landed in their sector. Communications were further disrupted by the very actions of the paratroopers, who cut telephone lines and ambushed messengers to prevent the Germans from organizing an effective response. By dawn, the German commanders were drowning in conflicting information. They did not realize that only 2 American airborne divisions were involved. To them, it seemed as if hundreds of separate airborne units had descended on Normandy at once. The confusion had a direct effect on German decision-making. Units that might have been concentrated for a powerful counterattack were instead sent piecemeal to deal with scattered reports of enemy paratroopers. Tank columns were delayed as bridges were blown up or held by stubborn pockets of American troops. In some cases, entire battalions marched in circles, chasing phantom enemy forces that did not exist. German officers, experienced and battle-hardened though they were, had never faced this kind of warfare before. They were used to clear front lines and well-defined enemy positions. Now, the battlefield was everywhere and nowhere at once. The psychological impact was severe. As the night wore on, panic began to spread among lower-ranking officers and enlisted men. Villagers reported seeing paratroopers in places where none had actually landed. German soldiers fired on shadows, convinced they were under attack. Senior officers tried to maintain control, but even they began to feel the weight of uncertainty. The realization that the enemy had the ability to insert thousands of soldiers deep behind their lines shattered their confidence. This was not a diversionary raid or a small commando strike. It was a full-scale invasion, and it was unfolding faster than they could respond. By the time the sun rose on June 6th, the damage was done. Bridges had been seized or destroyed. Key roads were blocked. German reserves were tied up in firefights with small groups of paratroopers rather than moving to the beaches where they were needed most. Even though many airborne units were still disorganized, their actions had created a web of disruption that slowed the German response to the main landings. The scattered drops, which at first seemed like a failure, had actually achieved a devastating effect. The German command structure was overwhelmed, and the first cracks in their defenses had begun to show. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, German command posts across northern France were filled with confusion and disbelief. Reports came in from every direction, each more alarming than the last. Radio operators shouted to be heard over the static as they relayed fragmented messages from frontline units. In some towns, local garrisons claimed they were under attack by paratroopers. In others, units reported roads cut, bridges seized, and enemy patrols appearing far behind what had been considered safe territory. The messages were contradictory, often unclear, and in many cases entirely wrong. Senior officers tried to piece together the truth, but the picture that emerged was almost impossible to believe. At first, many officers dismissed the situation as a diversion. For weeks, German intelligence had warned that the Allies would attempt to deceive them about the true location of the invasion. The Pas de Calais, with its direct route to England, had been considered the most likely target. Normandy was thought to be a secondary sector, lightly defended and not ideal for large-scale landings. When the first reports of airborne activity arrived, senior commanders assumed these were small-scale raids meant to create panic and force them to move reserves away from the real landing site. In some headquarters, officers argued heatedly over what they were hearing. A regimental commander might insist that hundreds of enemy paratroopers had landed near his sector, only to be challenged by others who doubted the numbers. Without reliable maps or communications, no one could verify the information. One general refused to believe that more than a few dozen enemy soldiers had been dropped in his area, even as his phone lines went dead and his supply columns vanished under ambushes. In the darkness, with no clear front line, experienced commanders suddenly found themselves blind and uncertain. As dawn approached and more reports poured in, denial gave way to shock. German officers stepped outside their command posts and saw the evidence with their own eyes. The sky to the west was filled with the distant hum of engines. Columns of smoke rose from villages where firefights raged. Roads that had been quiet the day before were now choked with wrecked vehicles and scattered equipment. Prisoners captured during the night revealed the scope of the assault. These were not isolated raiding parties. They were men from 2 full American airborne divisions. Thousands of soldiers dropped deep behind German lines in a single night. For many officers, the sheer scale of the operation was staggering. They had read reports about American industry and production, but now they were witnessing its effects directly. Nearly 900 transport planes had crossed the channel in precise formation to deliver these troops. Each paratrooper carried modern weapons, radios, and equipment. Entire artillery pieces and vehicles had been dropped by parachute to support them. No other nation in the world could have mounted such an effort. One captured officer later recalled that a German general, upon seeing the battlefield at first light, shook his head and said quietly, "No army in the world could do this, except the Americans." The realization spread quickly through the ranks. German units began to understand that they were not facing scattered bands of saboteurs. They were fighting an organized, well-equipped enemy capable of reinforcing and resupplying itself even in the heart of German territory. For some, this understanding was a crushing blow to morale. Troops who had been confident the night before now felt surrounded and outmatched. Entire companies retreated in disarray, abandoning positions that had been prepared for months. Others fought with grim determination. The Fallschirmjäger units, Germany's own paratroopers, were among the first to engage the Americans. These were elite soldiers, well-trained and highly disciplined. They counterattacked fiercely wherever they could, often fighting village by village, hedgerow by hedgerow. In some cases, small German units managed to inflict heavy casualties and briefly halt the American advance. But their efforts were isolated and ultimately overwhelmed. For every German platoon that arrived, it seemed that 2 more groups of Americans appeared from the fields and woods. The flow of enemy troops was relentless, as if the sky itself were delivering an endless stream of reinforcements. At higher levels of command, the shock deepened into frustration. Hitler had reserved control over several armored divisions for himself, believing that only he could decide where they should be committed. During the critical hours of the airborne assault, these powerful reserves sat idle, waiting for orders that never came. Officers on the ground begged for permission to move their tanks, but without authorization, they could do nothing. When Hitler finally awoke and grasped the scale of the invasion, it was already too late. By then, the Americans had established strong positions across the countryside, and the German response was disorganized and slow. The psychological effect of the airborne operation was as significant as its physical impact. German officers who had once believed in the superiority of their army were forced to confront a new reality. The Allies had not only matched their tactics but surpassed them in ways they had never imagined. The sight of hundreds of parachutes dotting the sky, the constant roar of aircraft engines, and the steady pressure of attacks from every direction left a deep impression. Even hardened veterans admitted that they had underestimated the enemy. In the days that followed, captured German officers spoke of their disbelief during those first hours. Some confessed that they had assumed the Allies would rely solely on seaborne landings, never considering that 2 entire divisions could be inserted by air. Others described the moment when they realized their defensive plans had been rendered obsolete in a single night. What they had witnessed was not just a tactical move but a display of overwhelming logistical strength. It marked a turning point in their understanding of the war. The Americans had demonstrated a capacity to project power on a scale that Germany could no longer match, and no amount of individual bravery or skill could offset that imbalance. Even as some German units continued to fight with courage and skill, the overall reaction was one of awe and dismay. The airborne assault had shattered illusions and forced a reckoning. The war they thought they were fighting had changed overnight, and they now faced an enemy who could strike anywhere, at any time, with a force beyond anything they had prepared for. When the first light of dawn broke over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the shape of the battlefield began to reveal itself. What had seemed like scattered fighting during the night now took on a clearer form. Across a wide stretch of countryside, from flooded fields near the coast to small villages inland, American paratroopers held key positions. Bridges were in their hands, crossroads were blocked, and German units were either cut off or forced to take long detours to avoid ambushes. The scattered night drops, though chaotic, had created a web of disruption that reached deep into the German defensive network. For the Allied forces landing on the beaches, this disruption was vital. Utah Beach, one of the main landing sites for the American Army, was connected to the interior by narrow causeways running through flooded lowlands. Without control of these routes, tanks and artillery could not move inland, and the troops on the beach would be trapped. Paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division had been assigned to secure these causeways before the seaborne landings began. Despite being scattered and under constant attack, small groups managed to reach their objectives and hold them against counterattacks. By the time the first waves of infantry came ashore, the causeways were open. This allowed the Americans to move vehicles and supplies off the beach quickly and establish a foothold. Further inland, the 82nd Airborne Division seized several key bridges and towns. At St. Miraglise, a crucial junction point, paratroopers fought through the night to secure the village. Holding it prevented German forces from moving reinforcements directly toward the beaches. The capture of these positions disrupted the German ability to move reserves in an organized way. Columns of German troops and vehicles were forced to scatter or take longer, more exposed routes. This loss of mobility was one of the main reasons the initial Allied landings succeeded. The Germans simply could not respond fast enough to concentrate their forces where they were needed. The confusion extended to the highest levels of German command. Senior officers received reports of enemy activity from multiple sectors, but they had no clear picture of the overall situation. Telephone lines had been cut, radio messages were often incomplete, and rumors spread faster than facts. Some officers believed that hundreds of Allied divisions were descending on Normandy, far more than the actual 2 airborne divisions involved. Others suspected the entire airborne operation was a feint meant to draw their attention away from the true landing site at the Pas de Calais. This uncertainty paralyzed decision-making at the exact moment when swift action was most needed. At the center of this confusion was Adolf Hitler himself. He had placed direct control over several key armored divisions in his own hands, refusing to allow local commanders to move these units without his permission. During the critical hours of the airborne assault and the first beach landings, Hitler was asleep. His staff, unwilling to act without his approval, held back the armored reserves. When Hitler finally awoke and began issuing orders, precious time had been lost. By then, the American paratroopers and infantry on the beaches had linked up and begun to strengthen their positions. The 21st Panzer Division, one of the few armored units positioned close enough to respond quickly, was eventually committed to the fight. But without coordination or clear objectives, its attacks were scattered and ineffective. Instead of striking in one powerful thrust, the division's elements were sent in piecemeal, often without adequate support. Some units managed to reach the coastal areas and briefly threaten the landing zones, but they were quickly forced back by Allied naval gunfire and air attacks. The failure to deliver a concentrated armored counterattack in the opening hours of the invasion sealed the Germans' fate. From that point on, the battle became one of attrition, a fight the Germans were ill-equipped to win. The psychological effect of the airborne operation was as important as its tactical results. German officers who had been confident of their ability to repel an invasion now faced the reality of an enemy with vast resources and logistical strength. The sight of thousands of paratroopers arriving in a single night was a shock that few had anticipated. It showed that the Americans and their allies could project power on a scale that Germany could no longer match. Even when German units fought bravely and inflicted losses, the constant arrival of fresh Allied forces made it clear that their efforts were only delaying the inevitable. This realization weighed heavily on German commanders and troops alike. For the Allies, the success of the airborne drops gave them a critical advantage in the first phase of the invasion. By holding the key inland positions, the paratroopers created a protective screen for the seaborne forces. This allowed the infantry and tanks landing on the beaches to move forward without being immediately counterattacked by German reserves. The interconnected nature of the operation meant that each piece supported the others. Naval gunfire suppressed coastal defenses, bombers struck inland targets, and paratroopers disrupted enemy communications and movement. Together, these actions created the conditions for a successful breakout. As the hours passed, the initial beachheads grew stronger. Supplies flowed in through makeshift docks and landing craft. Tanks and artillery were assembled on the beaches and then moved inland along the routes cleared by the airborne troops. By the second day, the Germans had lost the chance to throw the Allies back into the sea. The window for a decisive counterattack had closed. From that point forward, the battle for Normandy shifted toward a grinding campaign of encirclement and attrition. The broader operational outcome was clear. The airborne assault had done more than support the beach landings. It had fractured the German defensive system at its core. By striking deep behind the lines at the very start of the battle, the Americans had forced the Germans to fight in multiple directions at once. This disruption prevented the Germans from massing their strength at any single point. The cost in men and material was high, but the effect was decisive. The Germans were left reacting to Allied moves rather than controlling the flow of the battle. In the weeks that followed, this advantage grew. As Allied forces pushed outward from the beaches, the positions secured on D-Day became staging areas for larger offensives. Roads and bridges that had been seized by small airborne units were now used to move entire divisions. The disruption caused on the first night set in motion a chain of events that the Germans could not reverse. What began as scattered night drops had become the foundation for a full-scale invasion of Western Europe. The battle for Normandy was far from over, but the opening moves had ensured that the Allies would fight it on their terms, with momentum firmly on their side. In the years after the war, the events of June 1944 were studied by armies across the world. The night drops over Normandy had been a gamble, an untested concept executed on a scale no one had attempted before. Many military planners had doubted that thousands of men could be delivered by parachute and then fight effectively behind enemy lines. The success of the operation changed that belief. It proved that airborne forces were not just a tool for raids or small-scale disruptions, but a decisive arm of modern warfare. Officers from multiple nations traveled to study how the Americans had planned and carried out the assault. They examined every stage of the operation, from the organization of the air fleet to the coordination of infantry, artillery, and logistics. They noted how pathfinders had been used to mark drop zones, how equipment had been parachuted alongside the men, and how supply routes had been maintained despite heavy losses and difficult terrain. These details became the foundation for airborne doctrines that would shape armies for decades. In the immediate post-war years, many countries began forming their own airborne divisions. Britain, which had already developed its airborne forces during the war, expanded them with lessons learned from Normandy and later operations. The Soviet Union, watching closely, built massive airborne units capable of moving thousands of soldiers behind enemy lines. Even smaller nations began training paratroopers, seeing them as a symbol of modern military strength. The ability to drop troops deep into enemy territory was now recognized as essential to any major power. For the United States, the Normandy operation established its reputation as a leader in airborne warfare. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions became elite units with a legacy rooted in the events of D-Day. Their tactics were refined and adapted for future conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam and beyond. The logistical skill demonstrated in June 1944 set a standard for rapid deployment that would be emulated worldwide. The combination of industrial production, training, and coordination showed that large-scale airborne operations could be planned and executed with precision, even under the most difficult conditions. Surviving German officers studied these developments with a mix of professional respect and personal reflection. Many had been caught off guard by the sheer size of the Normandy drops, but after the war, they had the opportunity to analyze what had happened in detail. Some of these men later played roles in the rebuilding of Germany's military within the framework of NATO. They brought with them lessons learned from both sides of the conflict. German officers were particularly interested in how the Americans had managed communications and logistics on such a vast scale. The precision timing of aircraft waves, the redundancy of supply systems, and the flexibility of unit organization were aspects they sought to understand and, in some cases, adopt for their own forces. The contrast between what Germany had attempted earlier in the war and what the Americans had achieved at Normandy was striking. German airborne forces, the Fallschirmjäger, had been pioneers in the early years of the war. They had captured fortresses and airfields through daring raids. But these operations were limited in scope and often costly. By 1944, German paratroopers were used mainly as elite ground troops rather than for actual airborne missions. The Normandy assault showed how far airborne warfare had advanced. It was no longer a tool for special operations but a major component of modern armies. The image of the Normandy drops also left a deep mark on the public imagination. Photographs and film footage captured wave after wave of parachutes filling the sky at dawn. These images became iconic representations of the Allied effort. For those who lived through it, the sight was unforgettable. Civilians in Normandy remembered the night when thousands of men descended from the darkness, bringing the first signs of liberation. For the soldiers who jumped, it was a moment of fear and determination, knowing they were part of something unprecedented. As time passed, these images became symbols of the broader struggle of the war. Museums, books, and films kept the memory alive. Military academies used the Normandy operation as a case study, teaching new generations of officers about planning, coordination, and adaptability. The lessons drawn from that night continued to influence strategies long after the war ended. Modern paratrooper units around the world trace their lineage back to those early airborne forces. Training exercises often recreate the conditions faced in June 1944, though with updated equipment and methods. While technology has advanced, the core principles remain the same: speed, surprise, and the ability to seize critical points before the enemy can react. In this way, the events of Normandy continue to shape how armies think about mobility and offense. For the Americans, the legacy was not only tactical but also cultural. The success of the airborne operation reinforced the idea that the United States could project power anywhere in the world. It gave the military confidence to develop new doctrines that relied on rapid movement and combined arms. It also influenced the design of future aircraft, vehicles, and communication systems, ensuring that airborne forces would remain central to U.S. military planning. In Germany, the lessons were harder to absorb. The shock of seeing such a massive operation unfold had been humbling. Officers who had once believed in the invincibility of their army now faced the reality of what industrial warfare could achieve. When Germany became part of NATO during the Cold War, these same officers worked alongside former enemies to create a new defensive strategy. They brought with them a deep respect for the logistical and organizational skills that had been on display at Normandy. The memory of that night also lived on in the landscapes where it had taken place. The fields and villages of Normandy still bore the marks of battle years later. Memorials were built to honor those who had fought and died. Veterans returned to walk the ground where they had landed, sharing their stories with new generations. For many, the sight of the open sky above those fields brought back memories of that first night, when the horizon was filled with the dark shapes of aircraft and the white blooms of parachutes. The legacy of the Normandy airborne assault was both practical and symbolic. It demonstrated what was possible when planning, technology, and courage came together in a single operation. It changed how wars were fought and how armies prepared for the future. The lessons learned that night continue to echo through history, shaping the way nations think about conflict and defense. The sight of those thousands of parachutes descending remains one of the most powerful images of the Second World War, a moment when the course of the conflict shifted and the future of warfare was redefined.